bands at a time when they were trying to create their music trusted me with basically their babies.
Hello, and welcome to episode 22 of the Who Cares Anyway podcast. My guest on this episode is Matt Wallace, and I will briefly read from his website here. Matt Wallace is an American record producer born in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who started out making records in his parents' garage in the early 80s. He attended UC Berkeley, intending to teach, but pursued producing full-time after graduating. Some of his most notable work is with Faith No More, The Replacements, OAR, and Maroon 5. With over 30 years of experience, he now produces at his studio, Studio Deluxe, located in the Sound City Center in Van Nuys, California. So in this interview, we focus mostly on the early years of Matt Wallace's career as a recording engineer and producer, beginning in the aforementioned garage at his parents' house, and then moving over to Oakland, where he set up his own recording studio, Dangerous Rhythm Studios, an 8-track facility where many bands recorded throughout the 1980s. Now, I think it's safe to say that even if they aren't the absolute biggest band he recorded, Faith No More would be the band that he is most closely associated with, given that he not only worked with them on their first 4 studio albums, but also worked with them even before their first album. We hear a little bit about that in this episode and how they sort of grew up together, the band and him. But we don't only talk about Faith No More. We do hear a little bit about, well, Glorious Den, Spahn Ranch, Tom Mallon, who, as we hear in this interview, was sort of like a friendly rival on the other side of the bay. They both operated 8-track studios that were, on the one hand, certainly a step up from a bedroom 4-track or anything else that somebody might have available in their home. But on the other hand, these were not the ivory tower studios that were only accessible to major label or really well-financed bands. So that sort of window of time when the 8-track recording studio was a real lifeline for independent bands, that's kind of a theme that we get into later on. And then toward the end, we also talk about some of the changes in the sort of role of a record producer now, as opposed to, say, the mid-1980s. But certainly, Matt Wallace is someone who has accumulated a lot of wisdom over the years, and I appreciate the opportunity to not only tap into some of that wisdom, but to also be able to talk about some of these less heralded bands, like a Glorious Den or a Spahn Ranch, that maybe didn't shift as many units as some of the bands he would go on to work with later in his career, but made some memorable music nonetheless. And so, with all that said, I'll go ahead and step aside and let us get into the interview with Matt Wallace.
Yeah, so I went from a garage in basically the Lafayette, Moraga area, my parents' suburban garage. And so while I was going to UC Berkeley in my junior and senior year, I was making records while also going to school full time. So I had an exceptionally busy schedule. And then once I graduated, I had the opportunity to either go into the field I studied, which was English. I was going to be an English teacher, and I was actually student teaching 9th graders. But I'd always had this passion for music. I had an 8-track studio. So I basically ended up moving to Berkeley with my girlfriend, then put together a studio in Oakland, California, next to the Fruitvale BART station. So, and I had no idea when I rented that place what a great idea that was, because I just found the space. I liked the space. It was an old studio that I kind of revamped. And I didn't realize until once I was established that how many bands really liked the fact that, man, Fruitvale BART station, that means bands from San Francisco could come out and get there very quickly, very economically. And that was really something I did not expect, because we had lots of bands. It was always, hey, we're at the Fruitvale BART station, coming on in, so it was really cool. And that's where I did Glorious Den stuff. Yeah, I did Glorious Den there. Then I did Faith No More stuff for demos that became the We Care a Lot album. And then, moving from there. Yep.
Yeah, so you would sometimes use other, because I think the We Care a Lot album was at least part of it was recorded at another studio.
Yeah, the whole album that was done in 24 track, and that was done at Prairie Sun in Katati. We did
Okay,
that
right. Okay.
in 2 3 day weekends. We recorded and mixed that album. It's pretty incredible.
And what was the decision there? Was there different sonic qualities to that studio, or was it the 24 tracks beyond what
It was the
you
24
had?
track. Yeah, they had gotten this woman Ruth Schwartz who ran um,
Mortem.
Mordem Records, right? And so she liked the band, and if my memory is correct, she put up 3 grand for us to do the 3 days, or maybe the band did that first, and then she put in the extra. So it was like the band put in 3 grand, she put in 3 grand, and basically in 6 days we recorded and mixed an entire album. And it was, yeah, we wanted Prairie Sun because we needed 24 tracks. That was a very good price. It was a residential studio, so the band and I just slept in the same place together, and that's what we did.
I'm guessing that was I mean, compared to what you would go on to do, that was a tiny budget. But at that point, was that the biggest, quote, biggest budget?
Biggest budget I've ever worked on. Also, the first, I think that's the first time I ever was able to make an album on 24 track. I'd kind of dabbled in it and maybe done a song or two here and there. In fact, one of the songs on that record is a song called Jungle that we actually initially recorded at a place called Starlight Studios in Richmond, and that was funded for by I guess like MTV. They did this like short version of that song called Jungle, and
Huh?
once that was utilized for what it was utilized, I took it, and once we were recording at Prairie Sun, I said with editing, I actually made it into a song. And so, but yeah, that was the first time I've ever had the budget for a full album on 24 track. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. And I was thinking, the time when I first interviewed Bill, it was like 2003, and at that point, we're just 18 years from the mid 80s, and maybe that particular reverby sound was considered like more dated, where I think now it's more appreciated. But then at the same time, Glorious Den wasn't maybe quite as heavy in that sound, but it still had a kind of cavernous or reverby sound that I know that there were influences coming from the UK,
Yeah, I think Joy
Joy
Division.
Division.
Yeah,
Yeah, how much of that sound was what they asked you to give versus what you
that's a
thought?
good question. That's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, but the two records are very very different in their approach. So the first one, I think that was more of a kind of a everyone had input. I think the band had input, I had input, and yeah, I mean, generally, I'm not a Svengali kind of producer, right? I think I've got a better idea, and I tell people what to do. I'm more of a collaborative producer, and what I usually do is I try to talk to bands about arrangement. Let's see if we can tighten up the arrangement or make it more compelling. And then, of course, I'm always game to get great sounds and try unique and interesting things. So I think it was pretty much a joint effort. The second record was noticeably different, and I think Jay will confirm this is that Eric was very, very, very specific about how loud he wanted the drums. And I remember, I still to this day remember this because I don't remember a lot about that time, but I remember very distinct days where we're on the console and Jay and I have a mix where it sounds like a band. It sounds really great. And Eric kept saying, "Okay, bring the drums down a little bit." And we listen. He goes, "Okay, bring the drums down a little bit more." And then Jay and I are like, "Well, it's just this is not happening." And Jay it reminded me when I talked to him a couple weeks ago that he just left. It's like, you guys do it. I can't do this because Eric really wanted a sound, and I understand what he was trying to do, and I think it was certainly interesting. But I do think we mixed those drums a little too light for what we were trying to accomplish. But again, generally, it's everyone. The thing I really loved about that time was that the bands were developing and growing, as was I as an engineer producer. So we kind of just held hands and just walked through it together. And we tried things, and some things worked really well. Some things fell flat on their face. And it was really, there was a playful energy. And because there was no real roadmap or script, I think we all felt like we could do anything. And I think that sense of naivete was fantastic because it meant that people made music like Faith No More did, which didn't work in any genre or category, where people were like, what is this? And I think that naivete was really great because a lot of those bands I worked with weren't trying to really copy anything. They had obvious influences, but they really took them, they tried to make them their own influence. And I thought that was really exciting. And I look back at it just realizing how bold a lot of those bands and musicians were because they really put it out there. They were betting everything. Like a lot of these folks were not millionaires. They weren't making money, with hedge funds. They were all struggling. They all had day jobs, and they were all in to make their music. And I have to say that there was a purity about that, and there was a thrill in being a part of that. I mean, to me, I remember just the energy crackling of being in a space where we could work together, and we all had this kind of common goal, even though we had different ideas how to get there, and maybe the painting might shift a little bit in different colors and textures. We all were pushing together, and man, that's really hard to understate. That do or die energy. We were all eating ramen. I was poor living in Berkeley. I ate ramen all the goddamn time. We all were really poor, and we just wanted to make great music. And it was like, damn the torpedoes, we're gonna do this.
Yeah, I was, looking at some of the other bands that you worked with, like in B Team, Necropolis of Love,
Yes.
Fade to Black. So different bands that made it. Like Necropolis of Love, I don't think they made an LP, but they made some singles and
They had like
EPs.
I did the very first single of theirs was done in my garage in my parents' place, and then we did one that was like a maxi single. I think it was a large 12-inch that had like four songs on it. But yeah, that we did out of Berkeley. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and then that was, I mean, I guess, but where Faith No More would stand out with you is that they were the one that you were able to continue with. I mean, Glorious Day, you did the demo and
Two
two
records.
LPs,
Yeah.
but were there others that you worked with who you felt like they had more potential, and there just were factors that kept them from developing?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think if pretty much every band I worked with stuck it out, I think all of them would have ultimately found their own level of success. I think that all of them had something compelling, and I think if they hung in there, their audience would ultimately find them. Um, and that's true of all of them. It's just a matter of who's gonna give up at a certain point in time. And with the best examples is Primus, because I was working with a band called Monkey Rhythm, and Primus would open for them. And I remember seeing Primus with like nobody in the audience, like nobody, and people were like, "What is this?" It was just such a weird outlier anomaly kind of music. And man, thanks to Les, man, he just had a dogged determination that that's just what he was going to do. And he borrowed money from his dad, and I helped them. I did the first recording of Tommy the Cat. We were at a place called Studio D. I did like three songs with them, recorded them all in one day, and mixed them all while having like a really bad cold or flu, which was unfortunate. But I think Primus was one of those examples. Like, just hang in there, and your audience will find you. And I think the same thing applies to Faith No More. Nobody knew what they were. They had limited success, with the exception of "We Care a Lot," the album, and then the song that became kind of a college radio darling. But they honestly just stuck it out, and then eventually the audience found them. And I still believe that a band like Faith No More, when we did The Real Thing, that record didn't do anything when it first came out. And I remember the label saying, "Hey, we love this record, but there's no singles on it, and radio's not going to play rap metal," or whatever that was called at that time. But they toured across the states in a van like three or four times. They went back and forth to England, and the band created such a groundswell that eventually radio had to play them. And the epic video that was sitting on MTV shelves for like 6 months, they finally had to start playing it because Faith No More made it happen. They refused to give up, you know. And I think that same thing with Primus. I think that's, and even going back to this band Death Angel, they recorded in my parents' garage. This Mercedes pulls up in my parents' driveway, and it's basically the aunt and uncle of the kids in Death Angel, and the drummer's 9 years old, and they come stumbling out of the car with their instruments, and they go in and we start recording. And I'm sure the aunt and uncle thought I was more of a babysitting service than anything, because I just had these it was like four of them. I'm just watching these kids all day long, and we're making recordings. But again, Death Angel, they're still touring. And I think that if you just hang in there, it will happen. I think B Team should have been massive. I think they're a terrific band. They also morphed into a band called Naked Into, who I thought were exceptional. And I did that
Okay.
band. There's a band called Yo, Monkey Rhythm, a band called Denim TV, Fade to Black, Your Firstborn. I mean, there's just so many inspired bands that were creating really, really cool music that really, if they could have hung in there, they would have made it. Yeah, I mean, there was such a live scene of really cool music that was just, it was really exciting to be a part of. And I still, to this day, as a successful producer, and I've even said this to individuals from that time, and thought of myself, is that am super grateful that bands at a time when they were trying to create their music trusted me with basically their babies. And 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 it that's really what made me the producer that I am today, is these young bands. We all held hands, we walked through fire together, we created this cool stuff. I made all the mistakes I possibly could, and I did some things correctly in the bands, and we all did. And it was that trust and faith where, and these bands were not wealthy and they come in with their money. I wasn't charging a lot of money. $12 an hour for me and a studio was ridiculously cheap. But that being said, they still had to really cobble their money together. And I was always giving them deals like, hey, I know we work 6 hours, I'll just charge you for 4. I mean, I was not a good businessman, but absolutely enthralled with the music and in love with the people making it and the songs we were creating. And to me, even to this day, there are moments where I think about, when you think about certain Glorious Din songs or Faith No More, any of these bands, there was a point in time when those songs did not exist. And then all of a sudden, there they are. And it's like, and that comes out of the ether. It comes out of nowhere. They envision it, they write it, they create it. And that to me still, I'm 42 years into doing this stuff. That can happen, that's magic. Absolutely, hands down, 100% undeniable magic that Roddy and Chuck could sit in a room and write the lyrics, and then Bill and the band could come up with the music for We Care a Lot, or Epic, or any of that stuff, or any of the stuff that any other bands did. Is still like, that's incredible. It still blows my mind. And I'm a musician, of a fledgling musician. I've written songs, but they don't ever go anywhere. These people wrote things that went somewhere, that connected with people, and they told stories that resonated with other people, and that still is a thrill. Shatter the curse.
I was reading this K-pop interview with you yesterday, and it's a funny thing here. I'm quoting you here. It said, "I'm sure you've experienced it, where guys are like, we need more green, like the sound of an ocean through a tambourine." And that reminds me of Matt Hall said something to me when I interviewed him that was almost identical. He said that Eric would say things sometimes like, play something green. And so here I'm wondering if that thought that when you were saying we need something more green was a reference to Eric, or if that kind of language was spoken by other
It's
people, or
it's yeah, it's not a specific phrase said by anybody. That's something that kind of came up off the
right.
top of my head, but it really illustrates the delicate dance between a producer slash engineer and a band and an artist. Oftentimes, young bands coming to the studio don't really know, one, how the equipment works and what it can achieve, and number two, they have an idea of kind of where they want to go, but they don't know how they're going to get there. And oftentimes, the language that's used to describe it is more either vague, impressionistic, or emotions based. And so, the one of the things I had to learn early on with these young bands is that when they said things like more green, or it has to have a more of a sandpapery feel, it was important for me to remove all preconceptions and tune in as clearly as I could to their radio frequency and discern what it is that they were trying to say. And oftentimes, even if, so say bands can speak in ambiguous, impressionistic ways, even when bands say things directly, even then you have to still read between the lines. And that's where the real work in production is doing what the band truly wants, maybe not what they're actually saying. Because they might not be saying the right thing, or they might not even have a vision of how incredible it can be. And so sometimes you have to take them by the hand and go, okay, yeah, we'll make this little, 2-story musical house, because that's all we want to make. And then in your mind, it's going to be a whole neighborhood, and it's going to go 15 stories, and it's going to have gardens, and it's going to have a monorail. So, I mean, it's really, they're the genesis, and all I can do is improve upon it. Bands can make records without producers. Producers making records without bands or musicians, not so good. And so, I always tell people, like, bands will bring in 75, 80% of the finished thing. And my goal is to take it the next 20, 25%. Some bands it's only 10 or 15%, but that last bit, you know.
Bring Spahn Ranch into it. What those guys told me, or Odell and Brad told me, was,
you know, I'll be very transparent about Spahn Ranch. We were not musicians, let's put it that way. We were not looking for a record deal. We were not ready for a record deal. I mean, it was a major freak out moment for us because we didn't have enough songs, you know. It was like literally very nascent.
Matt had done hardcore bands. He knew Eric. He knew what he was, you know, he knew, you know, Bon Jovi wasn't showing up. So, you know, yeah, he rolled with it.
I mean, I think they downplayed their musical ability, but they really both of them emphasized to me that they really didn't know what they were doing in a sense. But I don't know. I mean, did they stand out in that sense? I imagine you'd worked with other people who were relatively untrained.
Yeah, I mean, it's just such a spectrum of people who are like completely organized and their instruments are in great repair and they've got the money and the wherewithal to maintain them. But most of the bands I worked with, from my recollection, were on the other end. I mean, I think Spahn Ranch were probably more towards the other end of things, where things were much more haphazard or not as you know, whatever, clean or well put together. I don't know. And that's just the bands always live on that spectrum, and depending on how much money they have, can they afford strings, can they afford drum heads? That's always been an issue. But I think the important thing to mention is that the quality of the equipment has absolutely zero impact on how good the music is. A band with a vision and momentum and energy will either overcome their haphazard instruments, or they'll take the haphazardness of the instruments and make it their sound, kind of like what Spahn Ranch did. That's super, super important. And one of the things that I've always said, and I know I get a lot of backlash from people who own a lot of expensive equipment, and the one quote I will always stand by is, what you record is by far more important than how you record or what you use to record. Because it honestly, at the end of the day, just doesn't truly matter. All that shit I was using was all semi-professional equipment. It wasn't like a 24-track tape machine. It was an 8-track. It was semi-pro. You know, if you compare it to the real gear, you'd be like, yeah, it's got more distortion, it's got more noise, or blah blah blah. But it doesn't matter. It was that these bands came in with a fire, and they were doing it for real. And I think there's something about lower budget studios where I think bands are more genuine. I think once you get to Journey level and you're in fantasy studios with all this money flowing, they're still great records. There's no doubt about it. But I think these other bands were closer to the street and they were closer to the real things happening. And there's an honesty about it that I still remember fondly. I mean, I remember these bands, they were like, again, and because I was living in a 1-bedroom apartment with my friend John sleeping in the living room. So there's 2 guys living in, and I'm scratching together $160 a month rent. It was like $320 a month rent. So I'm in a bedroom, he's in the living room, and I'm eating ramen, but I'm making incredible records with bands because they're trusting me to do it. And I go every day, I would go in there just like, what are we going to do today? How are we going to record stuff? And who's going to walk in the door with this amazing idea that probably never heard before? You know, will it make to the top of the charts? Probably not. But man, and to me, just the space there, just the people in and out, and just the feeling was just, honestly, still resonates with me today. I'm still, the ripples of that time still splash up on the shores with me, because that's where I've really learned to do what I do. And again, was trusted by people to do my very best work. Even though I was, you know, a fledgling producer, I operated my absolute top ability, you know, with them, because I didn't want to let anybody down. I wanted to squeeze every penny out of every dollar they spent. So, and again, in that way, we were really working together. We were just like, we were locked arms and we go, let's go through this. And it was, what a thrill.
there were a couple of other, if you want to call it engineer slash producers with studios, Greg Freeman, and then also Tom Mallon, who
Tom
I
Allen.
know worked with. I was curious if you had any interactions with either of them. Hopefully not like unpleasant or
Yeah,
rivalry
yeah.
type interaction.
Who's the first guy you mentioned? I know
Uh,
Tom.
uh, Greg Freeman, his was called Lowdown Studios, and that
Yeah,
might have been a little later because I think he started that in more towards like 87, 88. And I think
yeah,
you moved to LA around that
yeah,
time.
yeah. I moved to LA, so I miss him. But yeah, Tom Allen and I were. It was interesting. You know, for all intents and purposes, he and I were competitors.
Right.
And he, I think, had the same thing. You know, 8-track recording, $12 or $15 now. We're in the same ballpark. I think he was a few years older than me, and yeah, I think we were competitors, but we were friendly competitors. We knew each other. I had mad respect for what he did. I thought Tom made some incredible sounding records. I know he's much more meticulous than I am, and he's got a lot more patience to sit and do, like, 50 takes of something. And his strength is really the details. And he had a very nicely maintained studio. His was definitely a noticeable kind of step up. Mine was a little more shambolic, and you could put your feet up anywhere you wanted. And I tend to kind of mix with my elbows, and I'm more of a broad brushstroke kind of guy. But it certainly admired Tom. We were kind of friendly competitors. We became friends later on in life, and in fact, I was supposed to. I was actually on my way to the either hospital or hospice to see him, like about a week or two before he died. He and I were in touch, and I really, I had a fondness for him. He did a lot for the scene. I know a lot of bands said that he was kind of a curmudgeon and kind of a pain in the butt in a different way, because I'm more like, happy, up with people kind of vibe. But he always had respect, and he did great work, and I consider him a friend. And yeah, I'm sad he's gone.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I never got, I reached out to him in that first phase of doing the interviews, probably like 2006. And he told me to email him some questions. And I think I did, but they were probably not as well honed as they would have been later on in terms of like knowing what to ask. And I never heard back from him. And then that was right around the time I put it on the back burner. And then when I get back into working on it, oh, he's passed away. But yeah,
Mhm.
he did a lot of kind of like with you and Faith No More. He had the Toiling Midgets and then American Music Club, and as his kind of
Yeah, and he worked with Chris Isaac on some records,
oh
and
right, right, yeah.
just supremely talented. And ultimately, so yeah, then he moved up to 16 track because he ran his business well. And he was able to move from 8 to 16, and then I actually did a Naked Into album at his studio because he let me use it because he knew I knew what I was doing, and so we just basically rented out the studio, and I recorded and produced Naked Into at Mallon's studio. But yeah, what a dear, talented, beautiful person, absolutely.
Were there other producers, engineers in the area that you knew or learned from, or
Oh,
had
that's a
any
good question.
interaction with?
The thing about that, I, for better or for worse, did not have the usual trajectory that most people have, which is usually you work as a runner at a studio, then you work as an assistant engineer, and you watch how people do things, and you watch the very, very best do what they do, like working at Hyde Street or the Automat or Russian Hill or at Fantasy, and people, and you work your way up and you watch people, then you become like assistant engineer, then the engineer's sick on a session, then you do the job and you become an engineer. I never was able to get that trajectory of learning from other people. I built a studio in my parents' garage to make my own damn record. I conned my parents into loaning me money. And they loaned me the garage for a couple of years, and I built out a studio. And I thought I'd make my own records, but once bands heard about it and friends of mine heard about it, I just started recording people, and I never got around to making my own records. So, the only learning I had was at Diablo Valley College. This guy Dave Porter, who had or still has a studio called Music Annex in Menlo Park, he taught a class, and I learned the fundamentals from him about phase and frequency response and Fletcher Munson curves and proximity effect and things like that. So that's about it. I didn't really learn from other people that I know of, other than just getting out there and really, like, I wired my own studio. I built like a plate reverb that didn't sound very good. I built a spring reverb. I wired together a phase shifter. I mean, I did stuff because out of necessity, I had no money. And so I had to just kind of make shit up. So, but I'm sure there are other people I can't think of off the top of my head right now that were doing it. But Tom's the one that was, I think we were really kind of like cousins. We were cousins, and we were aware of each other, and you know, I mean, I certainly admired what he was doing, and
At least you were on different sides of the bay, and so that could lead to a kind of at least a sort of truce or something. But
yeah, yeah,
yeah, and it
and we
seemed like there weren't that many. I mean, there were, in terms of like say 1978 or something, somebody's making a record, they would be waltzing into some studio that had no idea what they were trying to do, because it would be like there wasn't really a template for recording like punk music. And then you had, I mean, Subterranean had their own little studio, but sometimes there would be, like Flipper managed to kind of to get into Hyde Street Studios, and then the Popo Pies for their first record were in the Automat. But those were pretty rare in terms of people I interviewed getting into these upper echelon studios. Most of it was 8-track studios. Oh yeah, that reminds me of another thing in that tape op interview. You said that the 24 track was sort of the pinnacle. If you can't do it with 24 tracks, you either don't have a performance or you don't really know what you're doing. But when did you really get into working with 24 track? Was that once you kind of graduated into
it was
working for?
Faith No More. I mean, Faith No
Yeah.
More was the one that really helped me graduate to 24 track because they were moving forward. They saved up their money. They, eventually got Ruth Schwartz to put in some money, so we got to get in there and do it. I think Necropolis of Love we did do some 24 track stuff as well. So those two bands were helpful in doing that. That was it. So there's a couple of things I want to get back to the 24 track thing, but I
Yeah.
think that you're onto a really good point, and that is, the Automat and Hyde Street. Those there's such a high financial bar to achieve for bands to get in there and experiment with music. And one of the big advantages to semi-professional recording with TAC or Tascam or Atari and stuff like that, with these little, semi-pro recording rigs, is that it really created the space. In fact, now that I'm talking about this, I think that not only created the space for bands like that, I think it actually helped foster that kind of music. Because once you had someone who was semi-pro, who was willing to record your crazy band like Spahn Ranch, there was a place for you to do it. For Spahn Ranch to save up enough money to walk into Hyde Street or the Automat, it would have taken them forever, and they would have had to have real jobs to earn the money to go do that. And once you take the real job, then you lose your edge of being a really creative, weird, quirky, kind of obtuse, crazy band. And so I think that is really important, that semi-pro people like Tom Allen, myself, and other folks would allow, yeah, you got crazy music, you have a little budget, come on and record. I think that was really important. And back to 24 track, yes, I think that if you can't capture in 24 tracks, you don't have a good song or you don't have a good performance, because adding more tracks does not change anything. And Epic was done on 24 tracks and still sounds just fine. And I did a bunch of records on 24 track. And the thing about 24 tracks is you have to edit along the way. And say if you and I are making a record and we've done the last overdub, and you go, I really think we should put this sousaphone on this one on the song. It's like, well, guess what? We don't have any more room. What do you want to erase? And you're like, well, I don't think we need the tambourine. Okay, then we're going to put the sousaphone on. And so that gives you a framework and parameters in which to work within. And it means you have to focus your vision, because if we have 48 tracks, then we'll keep the sousaphone and the tambourine. And all we're doing, the more tracks you have, all you're doing is postponing decisions. That's all it is. So that means if you have 48 tracks, then when you mix it, you got to decide, do we have the tambourine or the sousaphone? With 8-track, I combined drums to 2 tracks. I printed guitars with their effects. I had only 8 tracks. So, once you get 2 tracks for drums, 1 for bass, 1 for guitar, 1 for a keyboard, and you got 3 for, vocals or overdub or another guitar. And so you really have to be economical, and you have to print the drums the way you want them to sound. Because I can't later on go, I'm going to make the snare more like this. It's like, no, the drums get stuck on 2 tracks, sometimes 1, sounding exactly the way we want to hear them. And then you record vocals with some delay on them and things like that. So 24 track, I think, is the pinnacle. I think you have to have a great song. And I think I still believe that. And the thing with Pro Tools now, you can have 100 whatever 68 tracks or 200 some odd tracks, and even within those tracks you can have playlists behind it, and it becomes astronomical how much crap you can keep, and then eventually you have to weed through it. So anyway, edit as you go. The Beatles were on 4-track; they edit as they go. Whatever, Pink Floyd on 8-track. I mean, you just edit as you go, and you can make fantastic records that stand the test of time.
Yeah, I think that's kind of when you go back to something like Angel Dust, where you know, for the time, especially, I mean, or it's still a very dense but also widescreen kind of very colorful production. But for the time, that was, you know, fairly distinctive production. I mean, in terms of the samples with the rock band and the different keyboard sounds and different things. Whereas that kind of thing isn't as rare now, and sometimes I feel like when I listen to things, yeah, there's almost too much information or too much clarity or just too much. But was that record up to that point maybe the biggest production you had done in terms of?
Yeah. That
Yeah.
was the biggest production. Well, that was the biggest production for a number of reasons. Number one, technically that record's 48 track. But what we did with that is that I all that allowed me to do is to fan out the drums on as many tracks as I wanted for to get Mike Borden's drums and also Bill's bass. So basically, I tracked the band, and we had like a scratch keyboard and a scratch bass and guitar, whatever. Got the drums right. Then I edited the drums, but that just meant I can keep all these different room things. So what we did is we had a machine that had all drums, all bass, and then we made a copy of it onto another 24 tracks. So all the drums were on like 3 or 4 tracks, and the bass. Then we added all the other guitars and things like that. And we never even played the original one ever again until we mixed it. Then we mixed it, we brought it back up, and instead of playing the copy of the drums and the bass, we were able to play the original drums and bass as we did down. So it was really more for me. It was I wanted to see how far we could stretch the technology and capture as much of the sonics to make Angel Dust sound the way it did. We still could have done it on 24 track, but that was my first and probably I don't know about only, but definitely my first time I ever did two machines linked up together um, in mixing. Again, when tracking, we were just working on one machine.
Their relationship with like the technology of the day was kind of interesting because they would sort of play with these current sounds in a way that was sometimes kind of ironic with, you know, using the I know they got the synth that they used in their early days from somebody who had recorded on Flashdance or the
Right.
soundtrack or something like that. And then, you know, they're bringing in kind of these more metal elements. And then by the time of Angel Dust, sampling was pretty new. So like I feel like you can listen to all their records, the four that you did with them in the early original era, and you can hear that they're of their time, but there's still a distinctive quality of the band.
Mhm.
And yeah, I don't really know where I'm going with that, but if
Yeah.
anything comes to mind in terms of like the
Yeah.
way they related to the technology.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that the technology did help them because I think by the time we got to Angel Dust, not only were there samples because I had a sampler we could do samples, but Roddy had a sampling keyboard, which was the first time he had that. And with a sampling keyboard, it means that he could take sounds and put them in there and edit them and do things with them. So that was really really important that he could do that, and that really expanded their palette. And Angel Dust was an expansion of palette because I one of the reasons I did 48 track is it was really important that I had ample tracks for Mike Patton to do what he wanted to do because I knew that going into it he had all these ideas of different vocal parts, voices, harmonies, and I mean that the most track usage on that record on the copy tape because the main tape has got all the drums on the bass. They used up a bunch of space, but on the copy tape was really Patton's vocals and trying to get all these things he wanted to voice and put out there. And we could have still done it on 24 track, but it was really nice to have an ability to spread things out. And Pat's like, I want another track. It's like, we got it. I'm going to put this harmony on. Okay, let's do it. And back to 24 track on Making of the Real Thing. Not only do we have 24 tracks, which limited us, but thing that I think is really not well known, and that is we had one Yamaha drum kit. We had one bass guitar for Bill. Either it was his Gibson Grabber or his Aria Pro, probably the Aria Pro. Jim Martin had one Flying V. He had one half stack, and Roddy had the Emax keyboard. Oh, yes, that's when he started getting the sampling. So he had the Emax keyboard. We had one of each. So it wasn't like you go to a studio and go, hey, what amp should we use? Well, we're going to use this vintage such and such through this guitar, through this, that. It's like, no, we had literally one of each. And Jim had an F-hole Harmony acoustic guitar. We had literally one of each. And the fact that we made a record that has such scope and different sounds is still mind boggling to me because we didn't have any alternative things to try. It wasn't like, let's try this other keyboard, let's try this other drum kit. Like nowadays you go, oh, let's try a different kick drum, let's try a different snare drum, I'm going to change the cymbals, I want to try this keyboard. Like people have like banks of keyboards, have racks of guitar amps and racks of pedals. It was, again, bare bones. It was still very bare bones making that record for the real thing. Angel Dust, yes, they were able to buy equipment and we could actually expand and really stretch and try things, which was really cool.
Since then, so many things have changed, and I don't even know if it's fair to even ask a question about like the role of the recording engineer in the studio in music today compared to 30 years ago. Given that a lot of people would say, "Oh, you don't need to go to a studio to do this because you can do it in your bedroom and you can have infinite tracks."
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think you're touching on a very, very valid point, and that is there's a group of us older dudes that learned how to capture acoustic sound, acoustic energy. And whether it's a kick drum or an upright bass or a saxophone or a violin or a Marshall half stack, you learned the mic placement, you learned how to deal with phase, you learned a lot of things that were super, super important. And to get a good drum sound, you knew you needed a specific kind of room, and you need to tune them properly and have a great player. There's all these things that really are about sound generation from something acoustically generating sound, and with a microphone you're going to capture that energy electrically and then you're going to manipulate it. And those are skills, and you have to learn a lot to do it right. And with no judgment at all, there's nothing's better or worse nowadays. If you and I are going to make a record, we just sit in your bedroom, we have a computer, and we can pull up the most amazing sounding drums that are sampled at the best studios with the best tuned drums ever. And within like literally 30 minutes, we have an amazing drum track that we can program, and it sounds like an incredible studio. And then you go, oh yeah, but this part I want to make sure it's acoustically dead. Okay, we're going to mute the room sounds. Okay, and of course we're going to open up. And then same thing with any kind of sound, because it's all been sampled. We really don't have to record anything with the exception of the human voice. Even nowadays, people with their guitars, they plug in directly, and with all this amp modeling, you can actually make a recording of a heavy metal band in a library and nobody would ever know it. Because you got your headphones on, you got your guitar, they'll hit the picks against the strings, but that massive guitar sound is only in your ears. But it's because the computer's generating it. So the good news and bad news. A lot of us have studied this and know how to do this, and it's a really important job, and it's essential to make good recordings. That's totally true. But moving forward, that job is not as valuable anymore because it can all be done within your computer with samples and plugins and all these other things. So the bad news is that there might be people losing jobs, but the good news in a weird punk DIY kind of mind frame, and that is you don't have to be a great engineer to make a great record. Just like back in the punk days, you didn't have to be a great musician to make great music. Even if you were a sketchy player, if you had a point of view, you would push it out there. And because of its energy and importance, people would overlook the fact that, oh, this guy can't really play drums or guitar or bass, but there's a great song. And so now that same idea is fast forwarded to people who are record producers, engineers, mixers, and that is, it's a very DIY thing. We just plug in our guitar. What do you want? You want a Vox amp? You want a Marshall? You want a Fender amp? What do you want? With a click of a switch, you have it, and also the micing's already done for you. Do you want the mic close to the speaker cabinet? Do you want it away from the speaker cabinet? Do you want it in the room? And so you don't have to actually leave your chair to do what we used to have to do. Every time as a mixer, you're sitting down listening, and you are constantly getting up, walking in the room, moving a microphone, tuning a drum. Oh, where's that buzz coming from on the guitar? Let's get a ground lift. Okay, here we go. Oh, got to wait, hey, in a second, the air conditioner's on, got to turn it off. So you were dealing with capturing the reality of the situation. Nowadays, the good news, you don't have to do that. You can just get to making music. So part of that's good,
Yeah, with the Who Cares Anyway book, the part of the subtitle is, post-punk San Francisco and the end of the analog age. And that part about the end of the analog age really just came in as I was finishing it in 2020,
Mm.
and we had this extreme jump from, everything was screen based as in the year 2020, and it just became more like it really hit home as I was working on, you know, the last, well, next to last round of edits, where I'm kind of mentally living in the early 80s, mid 80s,
Mm.
and inhabiting that, and then switching off, and then I'm back in 2020 and realizing, like, wow, what a jump this is. But that that wasn't that's not something unique to San Francisco, but what it did kind of hammer home was the idea that, you know that was the end of an era in which, like, the place where you were was really important, because now things are so virtual, whether it's like what you were just saying about instrument sounds, but also you don't even have to be in the same place. And so again, it's not a better or worse thing. It's not to say that, like, that was the golden age, but it's in a sense there's almost like a sweet spot where between somewhere between 8 and 24 tracks, or between this and that, being able to get into a studio but not having to spend a fortune. There was something there that I seemed to me to have been, like, especially conducive to great music being made. But again, that's probably just because I grew up then. So I don't know.
Yeah, but I mean, I
Um,
think that's a really, really valid point. And the fact of the matter is that you and I with a computer um, can easily make a record. We can program the drums, we can program the bass, guitars, whatever we want to do. In fact, you can go online and you can find MIDI performances of keyboard chord progressions. I'm not a good keyboard player, but I can just pick one of those things out and go, let's see, oh, well, that chord progression sounds good. I like it. It's on a piano. You go, what if I change it to a different sounding piano? So we can do this stuff without any help. The thing that I think is really important, that is absolutely, we're at risk of losing, and that is the collaborative process of making records. I think being in a room with people, arguing about things, fighting for something that's important to you, talking about sound. Like, let's go back to Eric Cope and Jay and everyone, like wrestling, like we want this sound, that wouldn't happen if we're just seeing on computers. Eric would be like, fuck you guys, I'm just gonna do it on my computer. I'm gonna have the drums really quiet. And he can make a solo record. That's great. And that's absolutely valid too. But being in the room or playing together and playing off each other and seeing that someone's gonna change the song, you're like, oh my God, yeah, let's do that, and you do it. And that sense of shared creativity is really, really, really important. And it is going by the wayside, and people are still making great records without it, no doubt. But that's something that's really, that getting in there and really fighting for things that are important to you, and playing it and listening and hearing, and it's the responding to other people as they're doing things. The response is the thing that's important. Of, like, feeling what they're doing, or having a bad mood and playing differently, playing more aggressive. People go, that sounds great. That won't happen with computers. They're just going to play it, and there it is. So again,
yeah,
it's not worse. It's not worse.
yeah.
It's just
This
very
is a
different.
different. Yeah, no, it reminds me of a really vivid thing that Will Carpmel told me when about how he would go over to the Vats when Bill and Mike Borden were, and sometimes Roddy, were rehearsing or playing together, and that they would just play these loops together for minutes, or however long. And then I was watching recently that video where you're in there with the different tracks from Epic,
Mhm.
and you were isolating the bass and drum part, and that's 7 years after Will was sitting there listening to them. But you were talking about how it was one instrument, and
Mhm.
that idea that it's like, people can say a lot about their music, or elements they like or don't like, or that were novel, but I think at the bottom of it is you have this really strong connection between the rhythm section parts of it. And that's something that, yeah, you have to put up with somebody else. You have to deal with their personality, and you kind of grow with them, and it creates one instrument, and this kind of really modular world of where you can have people with really great technique, but their session, I don't know, it's a different kind of thing. And I think that's something that uh it has value, that is yeah.
I think that's a terrific point. I think that's absolutely true. I think that Mike and Billy worked together really well, and they built this thing over the years. And look, there are times when they both are upset at each other, or not happy with each other, and pissed off, or whatever it is. That's human beings and human relationships. But the fact that you can set that aside And even though you might have an argument about something, but you can lock in like those guys. I mean, they are so ridiculously solid how Bill and Gordon play together that can happen, that kind of music can happen while they're maybe arguing about somebody stole someone's sandwich or, something happened. But then you get in the studio, you push record, and it's like everybody joins forces and we're going to do this. That's incredible. It's really incredible, I think.